Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome tonight to the Emilius Lecture Theatre for our lecture and book launch and in conversation with our very, very special guest. I sort of feel like a bit of a charlatan giving her an introduction because she doesn't need any introduction. Shami Chakrabarti, or Baroness Chakrabarti, but she made it very clear she doesn't like to use that title. And we're also joined by another Baroness this evening who likes to be known as Margaret, but she's known in Queen's as Professor Ritchie because she is a professor of the university as well. And we're delighted to welcome Margaret back, who's also an alumnus of Queen's here this evening, who will interview Shami in tonight's event. So last week, you may be aware that Queen's launched our Civic University mission, which sounds extremely grand, but what does that mean? It means that this university wants to make an impact not only on its students and its staff and its alumni, but on its people and on its place. Queen's contributes $3.2 billion a year to the economy. We employ 5,000 people directly, about 3,000 people indirectly, and we have 25,000 students, some of whom are here with us this evening, who make a massive positive impact not only to Northern Ireland and Belfast and the island of Ireland, but to the entire UK and right across the world, and we're very proud of that. But to be a university of sanctuary and a civic university, you have to take important steps around human rights and make a commitment to equality and equity, and we've done that. You'll see that we have recently set up a new scholarship scheme for academics under threat, and over the last number of years we've taken 6 academics from conflict areas throughout the world and brought them here to Queen's and employed them and brought them into the university community. We've recently launched 6 new scholarships. The Coppity Scholarship focused on students from Palestine in particular, which is obviously an issue of major conflict at the moment, an area of major conflict, where we'll bring 6 students from Palestine here to the university for postgraduate study. And they are fully funded scholarships. 1 is funded by philanthropy, the other 5 is funded from the university directly. And that's they're 2 examples of many of the things that we're doing right across the Civic University space. 2 other areas we're looking at is the markets, our neighbours here. We've invested $1 million in the markets area of our resource over the last number of years to build capacity and look at community development in that very important area. And we've also focused on the Shankill and invested heavily there with 12 primary schools to really up educational attainment. So we think of ourselves more than just a university. We are a civic space, we're a place of debate. We are a place that's committed to human rights through our social charter, and we're delighted to have one of the most eminent human rights experts on these islands with us this evening to talk about our new book. And we are also delighted to have a former minister, a former party leader, the first female party leader in Northern Ireland, and an alumnus of Queen's, Margaret Ritchie, with us this evening as well. So I'm not going to talk anymore because you really are not here to hear from me. I'm here to tell you the virtues and how great these institutions are, but you all know that anyway. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed guest, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti. Shami.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome. I thought that to introduce the book, I would just read a little passage from the introduction, because it seems to be, it's quite good advice that I've had from career writers to remember that you kind of did the homework already. You know, this was the homework. So this is just a little bit of the introduction to Human Rights, the Case for the Defence. You might think it's an odd title because I suspect that here in Northern Ireland, a lot of people understand that human rights are a good thing. But I'm afraid that back in England, from where I've just come, that's not such a universal state of mind. And I'm sure you're aware of that. So you'll forgive me if there are things here that seem self-evident to you. They're not self-evident, unfortunately, to everyone. To believe in human rights is to believe in human beings. It's to strive for everything we need to live with the possibility of flourishing in the world. It requires thoughtful empathy, an appreciation of our species as creatures of body and mind, of instinct, emotion, faith, logic, and reason. Individuals, but also social beings. Humans yearn for autonomy, but also belonging and respect. These twin aspirations combine in the concept of dignity. This recognises that every human life matters and that as far as possible, each of us should have agency in the way we live. Human rights provide the poetry of both cries for freedom and pleas for protection. When the sacred and secular collide, each seeks this special higher ground, as do all competing interests in battles for liberty, equality, recognition, and resources at home and abroad. The world is in turmoil, ravaged by wars, real and imagined, proxy and phony. It is riven by oppression, inequality, and impending climate catastrophe. What many had come to rely on as the post-1945 settlement for securing greater justice, equality, and peace is now once more in flux. This is especially, if not uniquely so, in the Middle East and in Europe, where 2 world wars and then the Cold War once began. However, despite all sorts of progressive advancement, global population growth and technology and weapons proliferation bring an ever greater interconnection that makes conflict anywhere perilous for people everywhere. As a currency of values, human rights are constantly called upon and yet still reviled. Invocation and attack may come from the same voices at different times. There are skeptics across the political spectrum. They question whether we need any higher laws, let alone fundamental rights of the powerful, whether via might, privilege, or numbers, may neither bestow nor withdraw. They contest the basis of these principles, their content, limit, application, and enforcement. Is it possible to agree, or at least establish the ground rules of reasonable disagreement so that human rights might survive and offer comfort and a compass for the future? I believe so, and this book is my contribution to that endeavour. In a healthy political community comfortable in its skin and which debates the application of human rights in policy and lawmaking, judges need not become overly politicised, nor need human rights invade rather than inform the business of elected governments that respect the rule of law. I consider various baskets of human rights and the positive and negative obligations on the state to actively deliver them or not to interfere. Civil and political liberties are essential to democratic life, as are social, economic, and cultural rights to any quality of existence. Very few rights are described as absolute, but many are qualified or limited by protections for other people. What can they help us decide? What are their necessary limits? These questions are essential if rights are not to be distorted and devalued beyond recognition. How much can we proportionately interfere with qualified rights, say to privacy, speech, protest, or property? Where are the potential clashes between them? The often neglected principle of equal treatment is essential to understanding and delivering human rights. As wars and pandemics, which bring death and hardship to some and eye-watering windfalls to others, so graphically demonstrate, human rights must, to some extent, seek to address the asymmetry of both power and protection that lies at the heart of every major injustice. However, they cannot by themselves resolve them. Human rights evolved from the ethical, moral, and political frameworks of individuals and communities through struggle. They now inform those frameworks in return. Their sparse but often lyrical drafting conceals tales of courtroom drama, political imprisonment, persecution, death, torture, and fighting the evil fiction of racial supremacy in the air, on land, and on the high seas. If you read the texts quietly, you can almost hear distant drums and liberation songs. Still, they also provide some binding obligations that must be enforceable in law against states and perhaps even supranational public and private bodies in the near future. Ethics, morals, politics, and law often overlap, but not so much as to undermine the importance of their distinctions. The late great legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin described these clearly and compellingly. Ethics inform my personal choices, morals how I relate to others. Politics is the way that communities and societies make decisions, and laws, one important way of declaring and enforcing these choices. As in Eleanor Roosevelt's famous adage that human rights begin in small places, close to home, it's in the personal sphere that we first apply our values and experience our rights and freedoms. A parent attempts to raise their child with age-appropriate levels of agency and protection. They seek to monitor, vet, and limit the child's access to outside influences in both the real and virtual worlds. Whether consciously or not, these decisions involve ethical and moral questions of the young person's rights to privacy, expression, and association, and appropriate limits on these things. The political community, as ultimately represented by its lawmakers, grapples with similar questions on behalf of all children. While most modern democracies will grant a considerable latitude to individual parents to make informed decisions in the interests of their children, they'll also set some enforceable legal parameters. Indeed, not to do so would be a violation of the rights of the child. When these rules are breached, there will be a range of both criminal and civil legal consequences for those responsible, whether drug dealers, pornographers, social media platforms, educators, or the parents themselves. However, the ultimate legal as opposed to ethical or moral human rights obligation to provide both respect and protection of the child will rest with the state. A parent may be cruel or neglectful and legally accountable for this under the ordinary laws of the land, namely criminal and child protection law. Still, what is commonly understood to be the human rights violation is when the state doesn't adequately protect its children. These rights don't replace private ethical and moral choices, nor public political and policy decisions with legal ones. Instead, they should inform all of these. When a child protection regime is challenged, perhaps for setting a minimum age for alcohol consumption or social media access that is deemed either too low or too high, the courts can be expected to give considerable respect, deference in domestic courts, and a margin of appreciation in international ones to the democratic authority and deliberations of those who designed the scheme. However, courts are nonetheless essential referees. This may be little more than a modern evolution of the rule of law that has long bound governments and the governed. While democracy and human rights are distinct creatures, they must walk hand in hand. As human progress has required larger and more complex public and private institutions, so it correspondingly requires that these be held to account via both the popular vote and the law. Outside the home, a self-styled whistleblower or a freedom fighter considers how to respond to the abusive behaviour of a corporation or a government. In extreme circumstances, they may decide to breach civil or criminal law, perhaps by revealing trade or state secrets, or by taking even more dramatic direct action. Even if you share my view that such conduct might be justified in the face of tyranny, the decision to break the law is just the beginning of this person's ethical maze. Human rights provide a significant guide even to what kind of illegal conduct may be conscionable. I'm talking about human rights values and principles here rather than laws for two reasons. Firstly, human rights and other constitutional laws, like broad duties to respect privacy, rarely apply directly to individuals, but instead to state agencies. Secondly, the subject of our hypothetical dilemma has already decided to break the law. They may have broken duties of confidence to their employer, official secrets legislation, or laws against breaking and entering, in pursuit of their view of the greater public interest in exposing grave abuses of power. Yet human rights principles, like the duty to demonstrate proportionality and to be no more intrusive than necessary, which usually serve to limit police power, must now act as moral constraint on our self-appointed ethical hero. So the whistleblowing journalist should redact the names of innocents who might otherwise be put in harm's way. The freedom fighter who attacks the dictator's arsenal should avoid harming people as opposed to property in general, and civilians in particular. By taking the law into their own hands, the outlaw, however well-intentioned, has taken on a far greater moral obligation to consider the human rights consequences of their actions. They have perhaps acquired even a level of obligation normally reserved for those who act on behalf of the state. In a further twist, this may in turn become a solid legal consideration for any court subsequently deciding how to deal with this law-breaking in the public interest. In the face of present global challenges, health and wealth inequality, technological revolution, violent conflict, and climate emergency, our human rights will be tested. Rights thinking doesn't provide perfect solutions to these acute problems, but it can be of assistance and enduring value in addressing them. Critics deploy a number of familiar, if contradictory, straw men. They complain that elite lawyers and judges use human rights law to trump politics and democracy. Yet they fail to consider that ground rules and referees are essential for democracy itself. They lament the many violations that aren't prevented as opposed to being challenged under rights laws after the fact. They paint human rights as the enemy of either liberty or security, and deliberately ignore the presence of both of these values in its carefully calibrated scheme of protection. Disturbingly, they attack both the foundational and universalist claims of human rights as greater threats to citizenship and the nation state than international crime, pandemics, global corporations, or climate change. These arguments and the ideologies behind them are far from new. A certain kind of nationalism and its close cousin, imperialism, have always preferred that rights be restricted to citizens, free men, or some other necessarily exclusionary category of humanity. But enlightenment isn't a single age. It's a continuous process. The evolution of human imagination and empathy, greatly enhanced by literacy, culture, travel, and other forms of communication, as well as by knowledge and understanding of our darker histories of tyranny, inevitably broadened our notions of personhood, citizenship, and rights. So to recognise the rights of foreign nationals and children today is no more or less alien than it once seemed to respect those of women, people of other races, or in bondage. While everyone is welcome, this book isn't principally for lawyers. It's a reflection on human rights for people across the democratic spectrum, whether instinctive supporters or skeptics. I seek to resist, or where necessary, translate technical language to equip people with the tools for further investigation and constructive debate. All human disputes are ultimately resolved by violence, negotiation, politics, adjudication, or some combination of the above. Rights and freedoms, while they are a celebration of the individual, are supposed to help communities navigate conflict without constant or regular recourse to war. It's easy to look at our world and see that human rights aren't winning in this important respect. We should all feel ownership of our hard-won rights and freedoms. How else can we grow in confidence in all the arguments about how they should be applied? To lack a general memory or understanding of what our most basic rights are is to walk even more vulnerably in the world. It is to be robbed of a human heritage as important as numeracy, literacy, art, science, sport, and music. The nurse, the coder, and the actor should be able to argue about whether the judge or the politician got a particular decision just about right or completely wrong. That is what a truly free society looks like. When we all feel more empowered, this framework of precious protections will be less open to attack by vested interests in populist clothing. It will be ever more potent in protecting people and planet for generations to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Shami, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along this evening. Shami is a room pal of mine in the House of Lords, in room 14 on the West Front, second floor. We are a group of ladies from the Labour group of several different types of ages and vintages, but nonetheless, we all have an abiding interest in human rights and the need to protect people. And we're very well aware, particularly over the last 14 years, of the inequalities in our society and for the need to address those. Not least Shami, because she's always working very, very hard on all human rights legislation, and particularly she was involved with us in the legacy legislation and also in various aspects to do with the Windsor Framework and Article 2 and things to be human rights compliant, but also the Rwanda Bill, the Illegal Migration Bill, and various other forms of migration. So we have done a lot of work together, but the most important thing is that Shami has been at the forefront of all our work in being a custodian of human rights. Now, on your behalf, I would like to ask Shami various things when I read the book that came to my mind. And the first one was, this is not your first book, Shami. And Shami, you used to be a director in Liberty for many years, as well as a lawyer for government, and was involved in writing bits for the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998. So Shami, what was your purpose and your driving force in writing this book? And by the way, I'll be bringing the rest of you in about 15, 20 minutes' time to talk to Shami.
Thank you, Margaret. I think that a few years ago, when I embarked upon this, I think I just felt really, really depressed about the state of Westminster politics, and maybe wider politics too, and in particular, the trashing of human rights. Now, I don't mean specific violations. I don't just mean, you know, oppressive anti-protest laws or anti-trade union legislation or the appalling treatment of refugees and asylum seekers and particular violations. I mean the whole narrative of the Conservative government in particular, but you know it goes beyond to the further right as well. And there are some left-wing skeptics of human rights too, it has to be said, in the academy and elsewhere. But in particular, this narrative that that human rights either belong in a bygone age and have nothing to say to the present moment, or that we just made them up 5 minutes ago to suit ourselves, and they should basically be trashed. And in particular, the combination of that cavalier attitude to rights and freedoms with a certain kind of post-Brexit populist far-right nationalism, to be honest. So when you hear Rishi Sunak describe, for example, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg as a foreign court, repeatedly, that is not something that has just sprung up, last week or this year. That has been a drumbeat that has been going on for years. And I just became really, really concerned that people in the UK could end up coming out of the Council of Europe, losing the protection of the European Convention on Human Rights, trashing our responsibilities under the Refugee Convention, and so on, without even knowing what they have to lose. And so, with a slightly heavy heart, I thought, I'm going to just try to go back to basics. I've written 2 books before. They were different books for different moments. The first was very much focused on my time at Liberty and the war, the early days of the war on terror. And the second one was my feminist book. But this was just, I'm going to go back to basics for myself, and I'm going to try and relearn and discover where human rights come from, both philosophically and historically, what the major treaties are in the world, what the critics say, and not just the stupid political critics, but the academics who, and there are some, it's some very fine scholarship in the academy, international academy, that's sceptical, and some of that was quite depressing to read because some of it's very eloquent. But I would read all of that, and then I would try to apply human rights to what I think are the biggest challenges facing the world right now. So to some extent, inequality, which runs through this book, because we talk about social and economic rights as well as civil liberties in the book, but also, in particular, tech and AI in chapter 5, war in chapter 6, and climate emergency in chapter 7. And I thought that's what I'm going to try and do. And that was the motivation. As luck would have it, the book was published just weeks before the general election was called. And I did fear for some time that it would be that Sunak would turn it into a referendum on coming out of the ECHR, but they have fudged it for now. But make no mistake, whatever happens at the general election, there is going to be a battle royal for the soul of the British Conservative Party after that election. And whatever our politics, we should be concerned about that, because that is a major historical force in the politics of the UK, and it will be there in some form or other. And frankly, we should all be really, really concerned and engaged in that battle of ideas as well, I think.
Well, Shami, that was obviously the basis for some of the arguments around many of the amendments on the Rwanda bill coming from the government, and also in the Illegal Migration Act. And yesterday, the Tory party manifesto said, if we are forced to choose between our security and the jurisdiction of a foreign court, including the ECHR, we will always choose our security. You have said there's going to be a battle royal. What should we be doing on this side of the Irish Sea to challenge that?
Well, you're already doing it, aren't you? So we're, we have the chair of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission with us today, and I think that we can all be very proud of the work of that commission in the recent challenge to the illegal migration legislation and the Rwanda policy and so on.
And legacy as well.
Sorry?
And legacy as well.
Well, we can be proud of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission in general, and frankly, I hope that in time we may have a Human Rights Commission in London that can be a bit more like the commission in Northern Ireland. I hope it's. I've said it. So I've said it because of the history And because of the Good Friday Agreement, you very kindly mentioned that as a young lawyer in the Home Office, I had to do lots of awful things. But one of the more inspirational things that I got to work on when I was younger was a little bit of drafting on that agreement. And the irony of that piece of nonsense from Sunak, and the man has no history. I'm not doing the Nigel Farage kind of dog whistle. People have said that. So when he didn't stay for D-Day, you obviously that's past your radar. Yeah, they're such a slick operation. Those people, they're so red, white, and blue, but they don't stick around for D-Day celebrations for these people who are still living, who fought in World War II. Extraordinary. But so Nigel Farage apparently said he doesn't understand our history and our culture, and people took from the culture the dog whistle that it's because of his race. It's not because of his race, and it's not culture in that sense. He's as British as I am. We're both the children of migrants to this country. Go figure. But he certainly has no history, and it's not. And he has no history for D-Day and its significance in the psyche, not just of the UK, but of the world, the post-war world. But he doesn't have recent history for the Good Friday Agreement. So when he puts in his manifesto that he will choose security over this foreign court called Strasbourg, with its European Convention on Human Rights, he's actually making a choice against security. Because, as you all know, the ECHR is baked into the Good Friday Agreement, which was about trying to achieve peace and security. So, it's just really, I'm in danger of ranting at this point. But
go ahead.
That is an astonishing.
We'll let you.
But no, you said, what can we do? What can we do here? I think that what I would look to you for in solidarity and leadership, actually, is that I believe that Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland civil society, in particular, led by the Commission, is capable of being a human rights beacon in the world today. That's what I believe. A place that was once considered, a place of conflict, a place of turmoil, a problem, is now capable of leading human rights in the world. Just as poor old South Africa, with all its continuing problems, has been giving hope to people that the international rule of law can even have something to say about that terrible ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza. And I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that we're seeing these two jurisdictions that I remember, from my teenage years being, there'll never be liberation in South Africa. There'll always be apartheid in South Africa. The Berlin Wall will never come down. There'll never be peace in Northern Ireland. There'll never be peace in the Middle East. I remember thinking those thoughts as a sort of can you imagine what a barrel of laughs I was as a teenager, right? But I don't think it's a coincidence that you have these human rights cultures in Northern Ireland and in South Africa. And I personally find it inspirational, moving, whatever you want to call it, that these values are now being used not just for the people of South Africa themselves, for the people of Northern Ireland themselves, but being used to protect some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, i.e. people arriving in small boats and people in Gaza.
Obviously, those are the most pertinent issues, whether it's Gaza, whether it's the genocide there, or people arriving on the boats. And you and I heard the arguments made by Lord Sharp of Epsom in challenging the amendments that were made and that we defeated them on. But then, of course, they overturned those whenever it went back to the Commons and using their majority. But notwithstanding that, there were other rights that you mentioned in the book about health inequalities and about those to do with the COVID pandemic. Yeah. And I do take a quotation from your book, which said, dead bodies floated down the sacred Ganges River while subcontracted Indian manufacturers provided vaccines to be sent to the West. If ever there was a justification for human rights principles to be applied more directly and effectively to international institutions and corporations, it was this. Because people were dying in India whilst we were benefiting from all of the vaccinations. So have you any further comment on that?
This is, apart from being, roommates in the West Wing.
The West Wing.
Or the, if only. Yeah. No, the West Front, the Western Front, as you called it, Margaret. There's lots we have in common, and you, of course, have been a relentless champion for vaccine equality and vaccine policy in the House of Lords. Day after day after week after month, ever since I've known you in there, and it's very important. And of course, we know that we've almost Scotomised it now, haven't we? The idea that we could be sitting like this when we were in lockdown, and and human beings being what we are, we very easily pretend it sort of didn't happen. But I think it's important to learn from that experience. And one thing that I learned from that experience is that, goodness me, when I supported the lockdowns. When we didn't have vaccination, when we didn't even really understand the nature of COVID-19, I supported this policy that was totally chilling to me as a former Director of Liberty, that people should be effectively all, populations under house arrest effectively. And people did live through enormous privations in that time. They gave up their liberty. A lot of people gave up their livelihoods. A lot of young people didn't get to go to school and college, and there are obviously consequences for that for them even now. But goodness me, Big Pharma wouldn't even temporarily give up exclusive patents to those vaccines when they were first discovered. And I think that is a disgrace. Right? So everybody else is having to, other industries, other businesses are having to temporarily close. Some people are out of work, etc., etc. But when these emergency measures were employed, they were not employed with an even hand. And I said in the introduction, and I say throughout the book, equal treatment is the key to the human rights kingdom. That is the most important principle of all. Because we all believe in our own speech, it's other people's that's more expensive, right? And so on, privacy and whatever. But equal treatment is the real test of a human rights person. And I think it is appalling that with all the emergency measures that we had during that period, we wouldn't share the recipe with the global south. And I think countless lives could have been saved. So you had countries like South Africa and India that have a very big manufacturing capacity in the global south, and there are others in Latin America too. They produce medicines for big pharma companies for export, and these countries were not allowed to just produce generic vaccines because the patents weren't temporarily waived, even though there was a big movement to try and waive them. At one point, supported by the Pope, supported by Joe Biden when he came in, supported by a lot of countries in the global south. And the bad guys, I'm afraid, included the UK government, I think the German government, countries with a significant vested interest in big pharma, and that is what that passage. That's what that passage was about. And we have to make sure that in the future there is more health equity. And it wouldn't have, these companies. The more people live and the longer they live, the more product they will produce, because that's what they do to keep everybody drugged, to keep everybody with their everything from aspirin to the mental health drugs, etc., etc. They don't thrive on death, on unnecessary deaths. They could have agreed to the TRIPS waiver, as it was called, and a lot of lives would have been saved.
And then finally, before I go over to the audience, you also talked about artificial intelligence, talked about the climate emergency, and also big tech.
Yeah. So again, a thread here, and again I indicated it in the introduction, is I think we're getting to a point where we are going to need we're going to need human rights treaties to be made more directly applicable to corporations, to international corporations, if human rights are going to be the powerful force that I want them to be a quarter of the way into the 21st century. Because they are the new imperium. Okay, what Britain was in the 19th century and the US was in the 20th century, the new imperium for me in the 21st century, the emperors they sail under logos instead of flags, right? They're Amazon, they're Apple, they're Meta, and so on. And, fossil fuel corporations, and we spoke a bit about pharmaceuticals. We're going to have to get to a point where these international corporations, they are bigger than states, they are richer than states, they can buy and sell politicians. I think they're going to have to be held more directly accountable to human rights treaties and laws. And I think that is an enterprise in statecraft that we need to achieve. We need a generation of statespeople around the world who have all of the ambition that the Roosevelts and the Churchills and the Clemenceaus and others had after World War II. That is what we are going to need to address the climate emergency, to properly address and regulate artificial intelligence and so on. That is what I think is required. And in the meantime, while we wait for the politicians to step up to the plate, guess what? Litigators are already finding creative ways to hold corporations more directly to account. And people don't like it, and that people don't like human rights being used in the Strasbourg court for climate litigation. Well, if you don't come up with, if politicians don't come up with solutions, they shouldn't blame lawyers and activists and judges for trying to protect human beings.
Thank you. Now it's open to the audience, and Maeve has got a roving mic. So who's going to be first? Don't be shy. Yes, Patrick Corrigan from Amnesty International.
Thanks, Shami, and thanks, Margaret. Firstly, thank you for all you do in the Lords in fight for good fight for rights. But I'm really looking forward to reading the book. We've talked already about Sunak's manifesto and the sort of the straw man argument about security versus human rights. I had a quick look at the Labour manifesto today, and there's a welcome restated commitment to staying in the European Convention, and also a commitment to repeal and replace the Legacy Act here, and that was the one that we've been pressing them on, and very, very welcome. But there was an omission that was in the 29 manifesto, it isn't in this one, and that was a commitment to legislate for a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, something that came out of the Good Friday Agreement, and something that, unfortunately, the last Labour government rejected the advice from the Human Rights Commission on. What is your advice, or what are your thoughts on getting perhaps the incoming Labour government to step up and to do something courageous on that front in the way they did in 1998?
Well, in the passage in the no, I understand this is a long running debate. I know, because a lot of people feel that that is a broken promise from the Good Friday Agreement. The passage in the manifesto that you referred to about repealing the Legacy Act, I think, off the top of my comes after a passage that talks about working with Stormont and very much working, and there are other parts of the manifesto that are about having greater respect for devolution than the Tories have had, and that wouldn't be hard. Maybe the way forward
because rights and bills of rights and human rights acts and ECHRs have been so toxic in Westminster of late, maybe the way to approach this is from here. Maybe the place to approach this is very much in Northern Ireland, in Stormont, across communities, demonstrating that this is, this is a grassroots claim and demand. And I mean, in a way, I think one of the reasons why it's so appropriate that the Legacy Act be repealed. And by the way, the last time I was here, I was at a meeting where this was on everybody's mind. So I'm glad that I'm back and now it's going to be repealed. But one of the most important things about that, I felt, was that the concern about the Legacy Act was coming across the board in Northern Ireland, wasn't it? It was coming from every political party, across communities. I think if it were possible to demonstrate that level of unanimity, support for a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, that might be the way forward.
And I would say also in relation to that, whenever we get back again on the 9th of July and pending a Labour administration, I think we maybe would use our position, Shami, within that
if there
group,
is a Labour administration.
if there is one, and there's always an if, to see what can be done about that, because there would have to be further conversations to highlight to them, because you're dealing with, by and large, a totally new generation who weren't involved in 1998. But we have to explain to them the importance of arriving at a Bill of Rights. Alison?
Yes.
We have the chair of the...
Even Chief Commissioner.
Sorry, Chief Commissioner. Am I supposed to call you Chief Commissioner or
I don't
Chair?
mind what you call me, Shami. I'm just pleased to be here.
Oh. Chief Commissioner.
That's fine. I have read your book and I thought it was really powerful, really important and timely, but timely for here as well, because one of the silver linings to the conflict in Northern Ireland was a firm commitment to human rights, a bit like post-Second World War. People realised what could be achieved by that firm commitment. Passage of time, however, has seen Northern Ireland civic society infected by the Westminster narrative and rhetoric that's going on. And we haven't got ahead of it yet. So there is a lot we can do, but we need this book here as well as in Westminster. And I would encourage everyone to read it, but really think about what it means, not just read it as a very well-written defence of human rights. But I do wonder what more we can do to unite across the UK as human rights champions and human rights defenders, to get the message, to bypass maybe from the leaders who are propagating a lot of this stuff and just get directly to people. How do we reach them better? How do we get them to read your book and to really start engaging on the issues?
I think there's something in what you've already... There's something in your judicial review, Alison, that I keep going back to this. You know, the South Africans have brought the case in the ICC, and it's the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission that is leading the charge on Rwanda. I think there's something in that piece that doesn't just have to be about litigation, that can be a communications piece and a media piece as well. I was slightly involved in the referendum campaign in 2016, and I think it's an absolute disgrace the extent to which the issues around Northern Ireland were absent from that referendum debate, despite how significant they became and are still subsequently. I think there's a really important piece about getting Northern Irish voices in the UK media to tell a story about human rights and their significance. Just as I think in the wider world, whether in Europe or because there are still enough people who remember perhaps not in detail, but there are still enough people who remember the significance of, who remember the troubles, or they've heard about them. They remember there was this landmark agreement and the Americans were involved, and etc. And I think there's something, I mean, in my book I talk about, I go back through history. I talk about the, American independence. I talk about effectively the French and American revolutions and the documents that came out of that. And of course, the Good Friday Agreement comes out of a terrible conflict, and you often get inspirational documents that come after periods of conflict. And I think there's a piece there about communication, about talking about human rights. Your case, for example, is presumably currently under appeal. I mean, if the election goes the way I hope it will, maybe that won't be necessary. But I think, I don't know, you'll know more about the logistics on that, but I would like to hear you, on the news at 10 or on the Today programme, talking about not just your case, but about the significance of human rights in Northern Ireland and what Northern Ireland has to say to the rest of the UK and perhaps even these days Europe about the importance of the ECHR, the Refugee Convention, and so on.
Thank you. And this gentleman here? No, sorry, you had your hand up earlier? Yes?
Well, don't feel you have to, just because Margaret's picking on you,
Well, I didn't knowingly have my hand up, but there was a question I would love to ask, which was about the ECHR, and I need to be very clear at the outset. I think the UK should stay in, because what I'm about to say might appear that it's not the case, but that's not so. I was quite struck when Jonathan Sumption made his case for the way the ECHR case was being used as a totem by the Conservative Party, and they would try and reform now, particularly doing this, was dreadful, but that actually to have a proper argument about the ECHR was worth having because of some of the issues you touched on there about where some people feel there is overreach on the part of the court, forgetting all this nonsense about a foreign court and so on. And what was quite striking about that, I read the article he wrote, I agreed with some of it, I disagreed with some of it, but it was well written and well argued. And you talked earlier about the ability to disagree agreeably. And I just wondered how you saw the reaction to that, because some of it was you're questioning a totem and you can't do that, even if you are Lord Sumption. Others wanted to engage in the debate, and it felt that the issues that he raised, which I agree could be agreed or disagreed with, were ones that actually were important ones. If you could just move beyond the Suella Braverman and Nigel Farage argument. And I just would be interested in your reaction to how people reacted to his article on that.
So, Jonathan Sumption doesn't like my book. He wrote a review of it in the Telegraph, and he doesn't like social and economic rights. He doesn't like positive obligations, and in his review of my book, accuses me of inventing them. A human rights lawyer friend of mine texted me and said, "Well done, that's a good idea. You invented social and economic rights." And I don't know where he gets the idea. I mean, whether he's just not read the instruments that provide social and economic rights, and whether he just thinks that all the case law on positive obligations is just total nonsense. He is somebody who feels very strongly that judges shouldn't be activist and that they shouldn't be too political, even though I consider him to be a very, very political jurist. He famously wrote a pamphlet in the 1980s with Sir Keith Joseph, who was Margaret Thatcher's muse or advisor, whatever, on equality. It wasn't very pro-equality, put it that way. So I consider Jonathan Sumption intelligent, eloquent, very political. Nonetheless, there are always debates to be had about aspects of interpretation in relation to instruments and in relation to to law and so on. But to go for this kind of literalist approach to any constitutional or rights document, I think leads to nonsense. For example, even in the United States, let's take the US Bill of Rights as an example, because there are a lot of literalists in the United States, a very developed tradition, and of course they've now got quite a conservative Supreme Court. There is free speech is supposed to be absolute. If you just read the text of the US Bill of Rights, free speech would be absolute. But it isn't, is it? Even in the United States, free speech is not an absolute. They have laws to protect, to prevent obscenity, breach of copyright, incitement to violence. So you could argue that they don't perhaps go as far as some of us go, or they don't have the express caveat in Article 10 of the ECHR that says you can interfere with free speech if it's necessary and proportionate for a number of reasons. But so the text looks like an absolute, but they would not, if it were an absolute, they would not be able to have the laws that they do have on things like child pornography and copyright. So I think the idea that interpreting instruments over time to meet should never be done. What we call the living instrument approach. To be totally against that just leads to nonsense. They don't have in their Bill of Rights a right to privacy as such, and so privacy rights have been read into the concept of an unlawful search. And even quite conservative jurists in the United States have gone along with that, because not to is a nonsense. So, there have been debates over time, for example, about the extent to which British judges should take account of the Strasbourg Court when applying the convention in the UK. And, there's been a bit of back and forth, and currently where that's settled, I'm quite happy with. It is an obligation to take account of the Strasbourg Court. British judges are not bound by it. Now, of course, if an applicant loses before British judges, they can ultimately go to Strasbourg and get a Strasbourg ruling. But nonetheless, the possibility of disagreement or dialogue between domestic and international courts leads both to change their mind sometimes. So I think there is room for debate. Of course there's room for debate. This is law. If there's room for adjudication, there's room for dispute, there's room for debate, whether on the pages of the Telegraph or whether in court. But I do have a problem with the idea that, the Braverman, etc. angle, which is just rip it all up.
Thank you. And the lady here in the middle.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question that's sort of on the other side of that, and perhaps you deal with this in the book at length. I'm very excited to read it. But I wonder how you discuss the criticism that, far from overreach, our interest in and reliance on human rights frameworks have caused a stagnation in policy making and politics that means that our aspirations have been minimized, that we have minimal aspirations for human flourishing, and that actually the sort of grander aspirations of like radical economic redistribution are hampered by our reliance on human rights.
So you're quite right to anticipate that there is a chapter that addresses your question. It's chapter 3 of the book, and it's called Trojan Horse or Human Shield. And that is the chapter which was quite painful to research, because this is the chapter that addresses the more intelligent left and right-wing critiques of human rights. So we've had a bit of we have the Jonathan Sumption. I consider him to be a conservative critic of human rights. He doesn't believe in social and economic rights, positive obligations, and so on. And those of us who do, it's all undercover socialism, blah blah blah. So that's the Trojan horse end of things. but there's also the human shield end of things, which is it's all bourgeois bollocks, and it hampers the revolution and it limits our aspirations and so on, and then some of the more historical versions of that say it was just invented after the war to bash the Soviet Union, and the Americans have used it against every, sort of left-wing or liberation movement, blah, blah, blah. What can I tell you? I disagree. I think torture is wrong whoever does it. Slavery is wrong even if it happens in the People's Republic of China. I don't think progressives or radicals or people who believe as I do in quite significant resettlement of the world, not least in order to deal with climate emergency, we do ourselves no favours. We do ourselves no favours by not signing up for respect for basic rights and freedoms and including vital civil liberties. So, Lord Sumption doesn't like positive obligations and social and economic rights. I'm not going to play that game and say, well, I don't like civil liberties because I want food on the table. I don't want the right to speak at the meal. That's nonsense. That is nonsense. And it is not progressive. It is not socialist. It is not the kind of utopia I want to live in if people can have the knock on the door and be disappeared and if people don't have free speech and so on and so forth. What can I tell you?
And in fact, you do say in the book, for my part, I believe human rights celebrate and protect everything that humans need in order to survive and thrive in this world.
Yeah, I mean, but your point is a good one. They can't be the whole story. There are going to be different flavours of societies because, and I'm a Democrat, so people should have aspirations that are greater than just complying with human rights. People, they're a floor and not a ceiling to our aspiration. And social and economic rights, in particular, don't have very sharp teeth in terms of enforcement. They're not really in much of the world about judicial delivery. They're about political delivery. So there's plenty of room, and they were drafted that way because they were drafted in the post-war period with huge differences between the Soviet bloc and the West about how they were going to deal with their economies, and very, very different developmental circumstances in the global North and the global South. So social and economic rights mostly are delivered by politics and economics. Civil and political rights ultimately do have to be protected, I would say, by judges. It doesn't make one or the other more or less important. Food by farmers, medicine by doctors, law by lawyers, but these are all important things.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
I have quite a frivolous question.
Great.
How can we make human rights more fun again? When I was part of the Bill of Rights Roundtable, 2006, 2008, it was really fun. It felt like there was a real collective sense that we were all in it together. And certainly over the past 14 years, we have seen much more individualism. And I think that has eroded some of the collectivity, and it's eroded some of the fun. And people want to get involved in things because they're important, but also because they're enjoyable. Mm-hmm. I feel like we've lost that a bit. So it is a bit frivolous, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't think it's frivolous at all. I think, we are social creatures, and social movements are partly about fun, or partly about the buzz that you get by being involved, being part of something. I always say, solidarity is a magic word because it describes where you want to get to, but also the means of transport. And human rights also are cultural rights. human rights can be campaigned for and articulated in theatre and literature and film, as well as in sort of polemics and journalism and pompous speeches. So there are lots of ways to make this fun, to make it inclusive, to make it understandable and accessible. And that, in a way, was the book is supposed to be part of that project. But I think we need lots more. I mean, it's a bit like Alison's question. What can we do to make this more inclusive, more accessible, and what can people in Northern Ireland and people in this room who know better, what can they do to be part of this this discovery or rediscovery of the importance of rights and freedoms, not just here, but all over the UK and the wider world. I think some of that is about fun. Some of that is about capturing imaginations with stories and theatre and so on.
Thank you. Anything else? Yes, Peter from Troca.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks very much, Shami, as well. I just wanted to pick up on some of the points you raised about kind of business and human rights. It's something Troca works with those in the Global South, and it's obviously something that we see a huge impact on communities that are very vulnerable of the impact of business on them. And I wanted to ask what your thoughts were around the prospect for Business and Human Rights Act under a new government. It's something we've been talking with Margaret about quite a bit as an organisation, but what are your thoughts around maybe the prospects for that, but also how do you create an act like that doesn't get watered down by those corporations itself, which is something that the EU legislation that has been passed, I think we would feel is a lot weaker in its final form because of that. So, yeah, that's...
Well, this is a perennial challenge, isn't it? And not just at domestic, at the domestic, the local and the domestic level, the regional European level, and at the global level. And we talked about the TRIPS waiver that wasn't activated in the pandemic and should have been, and people died as a result. So this is a challenge that, in every aspect of the book, whether it's climate, whether it's tech, whether it's health inequality, whether it's weapons, we've got these corporations that, and they incorporate in one jurisdiction, they plunder in another jurisdiction, their workers are in another jurisdiction, their shareholders are everywhere. So you've also got the Byzantine organisational system that makes it very, very hard. And so you've got, you sue them in one place. You could say an oil company, you sue them in one place. They say, no, you shouldn't be suing me here. I'm going to take a jurisdictional point. Don't sue me in the Niger Delta. Sue me in the Netherlands because that's where I'm incorporated, for example. Not that I'm talking about Shell. So look, it's a perennial challenge. We've got to just keep campaigning. I've been going around talking about this book, and it's coincided with some campaigners talking about fossil fuel. There's a campaign called Fossil Free Books, and they were campaigning around these book festivals at home that were taking sponsorship from an institution called Baillie Gifford. And this is the Hay on Wye Festival, the Edinburgh Festival, and the list went on. And they campaigned, and now those festivals have dropped their sponsorship from this firm that is, in fossil fuels, in big tech, in arms, it would seem. And they campaigned, and there was a boycott, and I dropped out of the Hay Festival, and then I went when the boycott succeeded. What can I tell you? It's good old-fashioned campaigning. It's got to be local, it's got to be regional, it's got to be international. And we've got to, but it is one of the biggest challenges. People talk about, oh, AI, well, yeah, AI is very scary. AI is a man-made creature that is now potentially beyond our control. Well, so is the corporation. So is the international corporation. So, but I'm with you in the, if you read the book, you'll see that is a thread that runs all the way through.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had quite a discussion here this evening on a panoply of human rights. And I think Shami and myself have some areas as food for thought to bring back to the Labour group and hopefully a potentially Labour administration in Whitehall and Westminster. But notwithstanding that, Shami is available now for book signing, for a little chat with anybody who would like one, and so am I. So could I thank Shami on your behalf for coming over here?
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for having me.
And you asked me several months ago, would I organise, because you were going up to Scotland and you were going to Wales and you were obviously doing it within England as well. So I was quite happy to host this. And my good friends here in Queen's, I had them tortured between James and Morris. But anyway, could I thank them as well and thank all of you for coming here this evening. And Shami's available for book signing and for a little chat.
Thank you, Margaret.